Sons of the Forest is the second genre-defining entry from End Night Games that has you stranded on a remote and deadly island populated with cannibals, mutants, and otherworldly monsters as you attempt to both survive and, in time, uncover its tantalizing secrets. Straight from the get-go, mutated hands and retro-styled synth music tells you everything you need to know, that this is a throwback to B-movie body horror cinema, defined by movies of the time like The Island of Dr. Moreau through to The Reanimator, and parodied by the likes of Tarantino and Rodriguez with Grindhouse.
When the laws of science are broken.
We're talking charming and cheap horror with comical amounts of gore, janky special effects, all topped off with a story that's equal parts absurd and exciting. And that is exactly what the Forest series is. And it takes full advantage of this, basically smothering its various plot holes with dark humour and charm. Don't get me wrong, it doesn't forgo realism at the cost of immersion. It's very realistic when it counts, but it does rock a sort of campy, hyper-stylized tone for the sake of entertainment that allows you to gloss over things like the fact that Calvin fell from a helicopter and ended up with a concussion. You just have to trust me and the absolute legion of die-hard fans that it definitely works. This second entry boasts a far higher budget than the first, which allowed them to effectively redesign a number of the core gameplay mechanics from the ground up, creating what would be most simple to describe as a more accessible game. Fans of the original will have a lot to say about the changes, most notably the base building was more complex and probably necessary in the first game, but it's so much more refined now that you might find it hard to go back, depending how tolerant you are of games built on a budget. Considering Sun stands toe-to-toe with incredibly popular titles like Valheim and Subnautica in its attempts to pioneer within the open-world base-building adventure genre, it does do an incredible job of blazing its own trail in regards to visuals, lore, and most importantly, the gameplay. The most famous innovation being the absolutely brilliant inventory screen that once seen can never be forgotten. The game is not without its faults, and we will get into that, but know that if you enjoy building cozy bases, hunting for resources, and progressing an intriguing narrative at your leisure, then Sons of Forest is probably for you. I'm going to attempt to do this relatively spoiler-free too, so if you think you need convincing, watch on. And again, my little channel is growing, so a like or better yet a subscribe would mean more to me than you can imagine. So if you enjoy this, I would be so grateful for the support. Thank you very much. Now, if you've never played the prequel, The Forest, then you will need a recap, as this game builds directly on the story. If you don't want to know what happened for any reason, just hop forward to the next chapter. But, in short, you played as TV survival expert Eric LeBlanc, who crash-landed on the titular forested island and saw his son carried away by a man in red paint. By overcoming native cannibals, starvation, and creepy caves filled with mutants, Eric eventually bypassed an epic sinkhole to find hidden laboratories where an ancient artifact was being used to experiment with resurrection, hence all the mutants. It doesn't work out well for pretty much anyone, most of all the man in red, whose resurrected daughter kills him before getting unresurrected by Eric. Eric then has to make some pretty dubious moral choices to get his son out alive, but not without little Timmy sustaining long-term effects from the artifact. The last we see of him a few years on, and he's struggling with his condition and life in general in a grubby apartment. Jump forward 16 years from Eric's adventure, and we now take control of a new character whose identity and motivations are revealed in time with just about everything else through tactically placed notes as the game progresses. But long before any of the story is made available to you, you'll need to survive. Depending on luck, as far as I can tell, you'll be shot down and you narrowly escape with your life in one of 3 locations. Either the beach, the forest, or the mountains, which is where I first begun. A brilliant new addition to the game is Kelvin, a squad mate rendered deaf and mute after the crash, who serves as your building buddy throughout. He won't enter caves or fight enemies, but through an innovative command system he can be instructed to do things like fix and maintain the base, or cut down trees and filled holders. To say that this is invaluable is an understatement. By timing your activities with his commands effectively, he can complete so much of the tedious grunt work found in the first game, which allows you to get on with fun things like decorating your base, or essential activities like hunting. One notable aspect of the base building system in Sons of the Forest is that this isn't Minecraft or Valheim. By surrounding yourself with walls and sleeping in a bed high up, you cannot avoid the systematic attacks from enemies during the night. When you're without sleep, your stamina is at its lowest, which impacts your melee ability, and in the dark you're like a fly attempting to do battle with a fly swat, especially early game when you've only got your funky purple lighter for illumination. Without food and water, this is doubled down, and without effective weapons, literally forget about it. And considering that there isn't enough time in the day to secure all those things while simultaneously indulging in lengthy base building sessions, the early grind becomes very apparent. In fact, base building while operating on sparse resources is not only frustrating, it's downright hard. And this brings me on to the first, probably biggest issue for me. After completing the game, I did convince a mate to play with me for a bit, and only then did I discover this. The increase in difficulty when playing alone is considerable. The more players, the easier it gets, because despite the enemy scaling, resource management is the most significant obstacle to survival. One of you hunts enough food and collects enough water to sustain you for 24 hours. Another can explore for resources in order to build traps and armor, and scavenge for much needed medication for the inevitable battle you'll face that night. And one of you can go back and forth and spend hours collecting rocks to build a wall and set up hokey pokey traps, which I think are the only defense system worth a damn. And in battle, you can then focus your attacks on heavy enemies and strategize accordingly. Alone you have to manage it all, and while it is doable, it's infinitely easier once you have your outer wall set up and doorways through which you can funnel your enemies into traps and so on. I don't really think I ever remember playing a game that goes from so hard at the start to so easy by the end. Going to bed and experiencing this will give you an overwhelming sense of relief. But more often, going to bed and experiencing this makes your heart sink. At least in the beginning. And if you're trying to be good and stay invested, then sure, you'll pull out your makeshift bow and get to work, but early game, if you even survive a night raid, you'll inevitably lose more health and armor by fighting off the raid than you started with, thereby undoing all the work of the day. And when these encounters inevitably eat into whatever paltry resources you've gathered, you might find yourself instead quitting and reloading when a night raid occurs and trying the sleep action again, which I found myself having to do sometimes when I literally had like no health and no ammo and no armor, which of course leaves you pretty disenchanted because metagaming is about the fastest way to break the immersion. And good on you if you avoided this, but 100 hours of gameplay in, one doesn't need to doubt my commitment to the game, but at times it would make me scream in frustration, and not really the good type of scream. But contrary to this difficulty spike is that every time you reload, all of the scattered resources respawn. And so if you've placed your base in a location near core crafting items like tape and rope, or better yet, a source of food and drink, or maybe even medication, you start to appreciate how every game load brings fresh consumables to your cores. Look at how-to guides and you'll find that this is the #1 tip. And in my weakest moments, starving, thirsty, and pummeled to within an inch of my life, it often felt like there was no other way. And unless you customize your game and switch this off or play on hardcore or whatever, you can't not make use of this trick, because every time you quit and return, you'd be mad not to collect any invaluable items on your doorstep, which did at times leave me slightly resenting the game because I'd prefer not to be pressured into breaking the immersion by revisiting the same plundered spots again and again for respawning gear. However, there is a very easy way to mitigate this potential frustration, believe it or not, and it is in fact to not build a big base too early. A fortified location of some description, sure, but a base worthy of the incredible base building mechanics comes later, if at all. The game loop is split into 3 areas, effectively. The outside world, where you build bases and spend most of your time, hence the title of the game. Bunkers, where found key cards allow you to progress the overarching narrative. And caves, which contain vital equipment for progression, thus also progressing the game. In order to make your life a little easier, you actually want to get stuck into a couple of caves using whatever rudimentary weapons you've built, because it is here that you'll find the consumables that allow you to build up a reserve of armor, which is probably the most significant hurdle. You can also find bits and pieces in outposts, but not in the same volume. And armor entirely soaks up damage, keeping your supply of meds untouched, and can be made from bones, tape, and rope, or by ripping the skin from mutants, all of which can be found in abundance in the more challenging areas, namely Caves. If you rinse and repeat, you can end up with a full set of 10 pieces on your body, and another 10 pieces of each type in your inventory, which is a heap more than you'll need to tackle any obstacle in the game. And it took me quite a few in-game days of building and getting murdered by the natives before I clocked onto this, and while I perhaps blame myself for being so narrow-sighted with my personal objectives, all I wanted to do was build a pretty base, man. But the game wouldn't have it, not at the beginning, and not when I was playing on my own. So, to all prospective players, this would be the first advice I give you in order to avoid needless frustration. Prioritize getting some armor, however you do it, because without it, surviving the forest is a lot harder. Regardless of what you stumble across in your first few minutes or hours of playing, it won't be long until fire becomes part of your arsenal, and it is a valuable tool early game, allowing you to set enemies alight and watch their health trickle down from a safe place. As you plunder caves and narrative segments, you'll eventually get hold of game-changing firearms and more powerful melee weapons, most of which can be upgraded using a really silly but super fun method of galvanizing, using a local, highly sought-after mineral that from a narrative standpoint serves as one of the many appealing features of the island to insidious corporations. And later you and Kelvin are joined by a 3-limbed woman called Virginia, who starts off afraid and slowly forms a bond with you. And while she can't be commanded, she can fight, but only if you equip her with one of these found firearms, which subsequently makes her much more relevant in the latter half of the game. As you've probably guessed from the 3 limbs, she is connected to the island and the story in a somewhat clunky manner, but like I said, B-movie, so don't give it too much thought. Just accept her for what she is and push on with the game, and you'll come to be quite fond of her and Kelvin's company, namely when they turn up outside cave entrances with a smile after you've finished a daunting narrative segment. The caves you plunder usually contain one small part of a narrative-specific artifact, as well as an essential tool, but the two will never be in the same place, which necessitates that you explore absolutely every pathway of every cave, every single time without exception. This might be the best piece of advice I could give to eliminate needless frustration and backtracking. The tools are varied, and I'm not going to go into details, but it might be as simple as something like a pickaxe for extracting said materials from the walls, or something more functional like the grappling gun to ride otherwise inaccessible zip lines, which until you have it will entirely block off an area and require you to return later. Fortunately, once you clear the enemies from the caves, they stay dead, so returning doesn't present you with a fresh challenge beyond getting back to the cave entrance. But while the caves are truly exciting and scary, in fact I'd probably say they are the only true horror segments of the game, once cleared out the charm does start to dwindle because all you're left with is a maze in the dark. If you're unlucky enough to miss a hidden entrance or forget about that segment you couldn't bypass, then finding the specific cave entrance again without a guide might prove to be a challenge, especially if you space your gaming sessions out over a longer period of time and can't recollect which of the generic cave markers on your map you visited. You can mark areas with GPS markers, but the markers are pickups just like anything else, so that only works if you found one. Suns doesn't provide you with notes in this regard, so if you have to back out of a cave that you couldn't complete, do yourself a favour and take note of which one it was, however you achieve that. Or better yet, place down a marker if you have one to hand, because there is no map in the game beyond your trusty GPS, and it purposefully only zooms out to cover about half the island at a time. Obviously, this greatly helps with the immersion. It is so awesome, and I love the way you hold it in your offhand instead of a light because it doesn't work in caves, so you rarely need the two at the same time. But it does also mean that differentiating caves on the far side of the map can be that much more of a challenge if you're navigationally handicapped, like I definitely am. In fact, when it comes to not holding your hand, then bear in mind that that is practically the mantra of this game. So much of what you can do or what you're supposed to do simply isn't explained. And while some may enjoy eternal experimentation, personally I definitely prefer a happy medium. Everybody's going to sit somewhere on that scale, so there's no point in debating on it, but just consider this fair warning. You might want to Google stuff, but don't push your luck because you might find something that you don't want to see. I endeavoured to avoid turning to guides for this very reason, because I value immersion above all else. And after completing the game, I cursed myself for being so friggin' pious. Case in point, I will give one example because I don't want to spoil stuff in case you really do sit in that camp where you don't want to know anything. But the example I'm going to give is circuit boards. All the other ingredients that turn your crappy bow into a grenade launcher, which is freaking game-changing, are relatively easy to come by. But throughout the game, I probably found a dozen circuit boards, and they all went into these highly valuable arrows, which means I never once got to use the high-end armor before I completed the game, despite having every other necessary part ready and waiting in my pack. Turns out that by smashing a radio with an axe, out they pop. And as radios respawn, it makes this a trivial collectible. So I was very frugal with my explosives, favouring Molotovs or the occasional scattered hand grenades that don't respawn, and the few explosive arrows I could muster. To find out that I could have been carrying literally dozens of explosive arrows that would have trivialised some pretty difficult encounters that took repeated retries was such a blow, I can't even tell you. I was a little bit pissed off. And it didn't occur to me to smash the radio because literally nothing else in the game really relied on that mechanic. It made sense when I read it, sure, but there's just no suggestion to try it. So I never did. And I feel it would have shaved a few hours of tedious encounters off my playthrough and left me with a richer experience. Of course, that's just me, I guess, but each to their own. So I'd simply suggest bear this in mind when you do play, and Google or don't Google tips depending on your preference. But I will say that if you have an aversion to metagaming, it is worth noting that much of what you can build is actually listed over the cog, and offering Virginia something out of your backpack reveals the outline of a pistol and a shotgun long before firearms are even hinted at. So in hindsight, I do wonder why they chose to be so strict with delivering some of these vital gameplay hints and so loose in foreshadowing others. Once I started to build an arsenal of weapons and equipment, I would allow myself to return to base and spend a few hours recuperating, building up a reserve of dried meats or pots of stew, meds and Molotovs that spawned in local areas, and strapping solar panels, wiring light bulbs all over the shop to light up my base at night. The more time I invested, the more gleeful I became, because the base building aspect of the game is so freaking tight. There are literally 2 or 3 tiny niggles I have that relate to not being able to have angled logs alongside a wall, like here where I really wanted to create a small rampart but couldn't, or light bulbs that are fine if mounted to the roof one log high, but if you got clever like I did and spent ages making a really cool double high roof to keep it out of the way, they would then be practically pitch black. Naturally, I refused to lower the roof again, having spent like 30 minutes prancing around trying to get it just right, and suffered with an unlit pile of logs at night for the next 50 hours of gameplay. Building larger structures appear to rely on some kind of weight mechanic or something. I chose to build by feel rather than mathematical understanding of the game's physics, so I can't comment on the specifics, but I did find that on grander structures, it was possible to add a column in error that then couldn't be removed, and doing so the old-fashioned way would bring the roof down. That was kind of annoying, but the solution here, obviously, is just regular saves. It was probably the only true frustration I encountered in all the hours of construction. These niggles were minor, massively outweighed by the huge satisfaction that comes as you snap logs and planks in place to build your base upward and outward and continue to flip through your survival guide for inspired new ways to expand it. Some pre-designed structures exist too, and you can place one down like I did here with a small log cabin and basically get Kelvin to build it, and from there you can then branch off as you see fit. I ended up doing that twice actually, the second being a more advanced lookout tower design, and the final result of my homestead is something I was really fond of, having built a lot of bases in a lot of games, and I thoroughly enjoyed pottering around inside as I cooked new food and hung up my armor and stocked my reserves. However, at some point, you will come to the sudden and rather disheartening realization that as fun as building a base is, it is actually a pretty fruitless task. Let me explain. Consider Valheim. It redefined base building games, and for good reason. None more so than the absolutely inspired system in which, the more you filled your base with cozy, high-level furniture that was constructed from parts harvested from faraway lands or challenging enemies or whatever, the more of a well-rested buff you then received, which would leave you empowered when embarking on your next adventure. By encouraging you to return home with every fresh haul so that your base might further empower you on subsequent tasks, it made the base an essential part of the gameplay loop. You couldn't progress without it. This is completely absent from Sons of the Forest, and at some point you'll have a sinking realization that no matter how great or cozy or well equipped your base is, It's a luxury and not a necessity, and following a more nomad style of existence might actually be easier. End Night actually removed the sanity meter from the previous game, which catered to this concept, going down if you maimed enemies, navigated caves and indulged in cannibalism, and going back up as you slept or sat down on a bench. Because he doesn't love benches. The impact was minimal other than a few strange sound effects, but the principle was still there. But here, there is literally no mechanic that rewards you for a great base, other than when you upgrade your stick bed to an animal skin bed which makes you sleep better at night, but you don't need a big base to do that. Look at this beautiful little seat on the edge of my porch I made. Even Virginia reckons it's cool. I got nothing for it, so naturally I sat on it once for some good footage. This is it. And I never did it again, which is a shame because I'd love to have been forced to spend a minute here or there enjoying the serenity of the game's lush visuals and calming sound effects. I know that End Night proudly thrives on innovation, they're known for it, but if they wanted to remove the sanity meter, they should have shamelessly lifted the buff concept from Valheim and given 2 fingers at anybody who said otherwise, because for now, all your hard work simply isn't rewarded. A buff system does exist, but it comes from the different meals you can cook, and I found its impact on the game to be slight at best. In games like Raft, placing your consumable in storage bins around the crafting table would make them automatically available, thus promoting the idea of hoarding everything you accumulate into organized containers. This sort of virtual administration of your resources is just one of the ways that you can draw satisfaction from a base in a base building game, and is an easy win from a coding standpoint. In Suns, whether using your cooking pot or mixing herbs and berries into concoctions that restore vitality, they need to be on your person. This simple choice suggests to me how little priority was placed on homemaking at the design stage. And considering that the game is no longer in early access, I presume that this is intentional. And the meds and energy bars are actually more effective and abundant anyway. And growing more of the plants actually produces such a small yield that despite having many pots, I relied entirely on plucking berries from bushes and just grew the things that I thought looked prettiest and left them there. You can carry 20 of them on your person anyway, so growing them isn't really necessary. Food recipes might also seem plentiful at first, but the issue here is a matter of balance. 2 pieces of meat extracted from any trap or a bit of hunting, and a pot of dirty water gives you boiled meat. That provides enough liquid and food sustenance to last you maybe 24 hours, heals you as well, and gives you a decent strength buff to boot, which is pretty generous considering how easy it is to make. I worked under the assumption that this is supposed to be your default meal, and I must have made like 100 of these over the course of playing the game, and I really enjoyed the cycle. It encourages you to build traps, it encourages you to hunt, it encourages you to be near a water source, it encourages you to grab pots when you see them, it encourages you to build a fire, and so on and so forth. But the remaining recipes, and I did indulge in them where I could, but collecting the fresh ingredients often wasn't worth the bother as the results were just so vapid. Eggnog warms you up and makes you comfy, cool, but the practical impact on the gameplay is minimal compared to, say, just putting on warmer clothes. Or take the mushroom soup, which gives you a stealth bonus, for some reason. I only found 1 hydrogen mushroom in all my hours of playing, and so the soup was unattainable for half the game, and when I did make it, I just found myself carrying it around in my flask in preparation for a really tricky stealth segment, which never actually came. Generally, the juice just isn't worth the squeeze, so whenever I embarked on an adventure, it was so easy and effective to just take a full pot of boiled meat that it left the cooking mechanic feeling a little lackluster. Of course, these are all totally subjective thoughts, and not all of us are here to be homemakers. Many players no doubt just want to put down a stronghold that you can fall back to and then get stuck into the island. Well, regardless, if you ever do plan to return home, then beware that reaching your base from further away places in the island does take an absolute age. There are portable gliders usually found suitably high up, which I considered not mentioning for the sake of spoilers, but to be frank, they are all over the place and you discover them pretty quickly. But once you found one, you can carry it with you, so the option to use it is always there. Thing is, you need to hike up a very high ridge or mountain to get high enough to circle right round to the other side of the island, and as the mountain's in the middle of the map, you pretty much have to cross half the map just to hike high enough to use it. So I think the glider is more of a gimmick than a reliable method of long distance transport, especially because keeping it horizontal to maximise distance actually means it moves so slow it's almost like walking anyway. I have a sneaking suspicion that its true purpose is to show off how utterly gorgeous the game looks from high in the sky, with views of the terrain casually reinforcing how expansive and abundant the topology of the terrain actually is. Other methods include using a sled, which reminded me more of playing Goat Simulator. The golf carts will have you drive in the opposite direction down unintuitive paths, or more likely recreating that scene from Austin Powers, as you pinball off trees as you try to go through the middle of the forest before inevitably giving up. And the very best method doesn't actually come your way until you complete the game and decide to stay on the island. This method in particular would have required them to tweak the narrative, but I really wish you had it from the beginning, so that time spent traversing the islands to maintain the use of your base would have effectively been cut in half, which I do feel would have been a far more manageable time frame if base building is something you tend to prioritise. Building zipline bridges is probably your best bet, but each line can only fire up to 50 meters, and so at no more than 100 meters a pop, and often needing platforms to be constructed for them to be really effective, it takes as much time to build the route as it does just run. And run you will, a lot, which perhaps was End Knight's ultimate vision, to have you play as more of a nomad, migrating around the titular forest, with bases being an optional extra if you want to indulge in something other than combat or exploration at any point. And then after completing the game, giving you an activity that you on your own or with friends or whatever could then do in order to make use of all the items and equipment that you've built up. And as you move around the map, there's certainly no shortage of things to see and do. Sometimes you'll arrive seconds too late to find one of your comrades succumbing to fatal wounds, surrounded by high-end gear ripe for the taking. Other times it'll be enemy outposts rich in resources. You'll actually end up pretty familiar with these because in one of the more inspired features that has become a forest staple, every time you fall at the hands of an enemy, you'll wake up in one of these camps, a well-timed escape being the only thing between you and freedom. Less often, but still abundant, are unique set pieces that might hide dugouts containing blueprints from the insane minds of tragic survivors, most of which can be used to further flesh out your base in inventive new ways. Multiple different variations of the same weapons can be found as well. There's like 4 types of axes alone, and I think what this means is you're not expected to scour every corner in order to find every item or weapon, but instead just explore in a way that feels natural, and just keep scouting around until you find enough that you feel equipped to tackle the objectives in your own unique way. This is exactly the sort of feature that I love in open world survival, where exploring is optional, rewards are countless, and while you often feel like you've been fairly compensated for straying off the path, you don't feel obliged to do it the whole time. There is no fog of war, no indication as to areas left untouched, other than the memory of whether you recognize your surroundings. When I finished the game and took a look, I was amused to find 2 or 3 pretty sweet bits of hardware that I was lacking, but other than a bow upgrade that probably would have been pretty damn useful, I didn't know to miss them. And this definitely encourages replayability, which is always a good thing. And there are plenty of other discoveries to be made too, from downed planes and beached yachts to shallow graves and military encampments, enough to ensure that exploring the island rarely leaves you feeling empty-handed. And I appreciate that running through the environment is how you end up stumbling across so many of these places. But once you've traversed the area, that's really it. There's no fulfillment to be had from finding something new if you've already found everything. Henceforth, you gain nothing other than grey hairs as you hike home with the sole goal of restocking the shelves back at your base. And of all the items I did stock up on, like say whenever I had a surplus of C4 or grenades, they remained unused on their little shelf by the end of the game because they were so far away that when I finally did need them for the endgame segments, I opted not to spend an hour to go back and fetch them. After I spent a lot of time building, which isn't quick at the best of times, and half as much time again spent traversing back and forwards to unload my inventory, eventually I decided to just focus on actually beating the game by progressing the narrative areas, a number of which were on the opposite side of the island from my base. For this entire segment, so the second half of the game really, I ended up adopting a far more nomadic style of gameplay and never actually returned to my base. Everything I required was stored in my inventory. Avoiding being out at dark becomes the biggest challenge, but literally all you have to do is put a tarp down in one of these inside areas, and ideally time your sleep so that you step back into the world at the crack of dawn. Once you get access to any one of these inside areas, which really isn't very long at all if you focus on them, you can just go to the nearest one, put on your cozy pink jammies that maximise rest recovery, and sleep on concrete without any risk of being attacked. There are a couple of tasks that you need to carry out that cause an influx of mutants to come gunning for you, which is awesome fun. And when this first occurred, I was so grateful for my base finally putting my heavyweight perimeter defences into use. Thing is, at a later point I wanted to fire this machine off again while living Wanderer style on the other side of the island, and as I had most of the pieces I needed on my inventory anyway, I did a little bit of scavenging, gathered the rest of the bits I needed, and then took the opportunity to build a basic treehouse and had another go, just out of curiosity. And I'm not sure if I was more relieved or disappointed when I casually defended the onslaught because it confirmed my suspicions. If I'd added 2 or 3 shelves to this platform, I'm not joking when I say it would have been every bit as functional as my full-sized base. And so it is that while base building is supremely fun and the mechanics are outstanding, and the variety of pieces available to work with is enough to keep you amused for weeks, it's almost like a separate minigame within the larger world, and it really cemented my feelings on this idea that it seems to be aimed at those who just want to keep indulging in the island after they've completed the story. Or something. I'm really not sure what the actual intention is, if I'm honest. But for me, once I completed the game, it wasn't really the first thing on my mind. I fancied starting again with a mate or at a new location or whatever, because once you get past the pain of saying goodbye to your beloved homestead, in any survival game really, the best thing about base building adventures is that the next time around it can be so different. But for all of these frustrations that relate to how they integrated base building into the gameplay loop, or didn't, you might find yourself asking the same question, which I certainly ask time and time again, which is, why did I enjoy it so damn much? Why did I keep coming back? Why did I spend 100 hours smashing this game until I completed it and have this sodding big grin on my face during the end credits? Well, the truth is, these frustrations don't actually stop it being an utterly enjoyable, exciting, thrilling, sometimes damn scary, and almost always beautiful game. I just love base building so much that I couldn't help but be disappointed by the missed potential. The truth is that has nothing to do with how well the game functions independently of this feature. I didn't want to hate on it, I just wrote this script in accordance to my notes and I've struggled to cut it down because these are all valid points. But I'm telling you here and now that if the aforementioned frustrations still leave me absolutely enthralled by this game, then let that be a gauge of how fun it must be to play. Gone are the days where graphics simply mean how realistic the textures are. There are so many more elements at play here, none more so than the lighting and weather systems. As you play, you move through seasons. Every 20 hours in-game, the season cycles, moving through spring, summer and autumn, which aren't so obvious to the untrained eye, and then eventually winter hits, and that changes everything. Snow begins to fall, which will undoubtedly catch you off guard the first time, turning the island into a serene white wonderland, which also freezes your rain collectors, kills plants and stops your hanging meat from drying out, amongst other things. This encourages you to take steps to prepare for a less hospitable period, and how you achieve this, of course, depends on your playstyle, but warm clothes in particular become a commodity to keep your stamina up. Still pools of water will freeze too, so along with an eerie cracked ice effect that masks the previously lush landscapes, it also comes with crunching sound effects that chill you to the bone. So if your base was relying on a pond to fill your cooking pot, think again. Running water remains unfrozen, as in real life, which adds a reliable layer of realism to the island. And when I built my base, I discovered this after the fact, so I got lucky. But this type of mechanic is exactly the sort of thing that keeps you on your toes in a survival simulator. Up in the mountains, it's always frozen, and this is probably where you'll experience the most sublime lighting effects. If you've ever been skiing or seen films where people navigate frozen mountains, you might be familiar with this obsession with sunglasses, and that's because snow can reflect the sun and cause crazy amounts of glare. Simulating this organically is no small task, and so it is truly amazing when navigating the snowy peaks, being unable to see and almost finding yourself squinting at the screen without realising. And at times in the middle of the day, the light might drop and you'll find yourself pulling out the GPS to check the time, surprised to see that it's only midday, and then you look up and you realise that a cloud has moved in front of the sun, depriving you of the usual midday rays. These shifts in season, sunlight, varying types of terrain and foliage, in flora and fauna that all shift with time and the physical environment, all combine to bring the island to life and continue to keep it alive as the overlapping variables run their course, meaning that experiencing an area isn't guaranteed to be the same twice. This doesn't help with the age-old issue of running out of things to discover if you reside in one area for too long, but it does ensure that the terrain remains an absolute pleasure to behold and serves to make your days in the forest feel like they're stretching into weeks and then months as you continue to play. And while the forest is modelled on generic rural wilderness, deep in the bowels of the island you'll uncover evidence of something far more otherworldly. I hesitate to show too much because stumbling upon these ruins is part of the fun, but I do want to take a moment to applaud the visual aesthetic that the designers settled on, all based around this mysterious element, solophyte, which is found in both its raw form, but also cast into mysterious shapes and configurations that will entice you to delve deeper and discover how these ancient constructs came to be. Much of this takes place in pitch-black caves, which unsurprisingly will be one of your biggest obstacles, particularly early game when your means to combat the darkness are limited. Various tools are available to overcome the dark, but of course the more effective methods you'll have to track down, including but not limited to your trusty lighter, a homemade torch, a flashlight, weapon-mounted torches, flares, night vision goggles, and so on. Managing your methods of lighting in long underground segments is a very real challenge, which in turn leads to some very frightening encounters if you're trying to be frugal with your batteries. If you want to use a torch and then light an arrow, you'll stash the torch for a second, which is pretty unnerving if your target has moved when the flashlight comes back up. And as I described earlier, the narrative segments become available as you collect keycards, which of course allows the developers to introduce story elements, weapons, and late-game enemy encounters in a controlled manner. The caves, on the other hand, are opened up to you fairly quickly once you find a couple of key tools, and from there, how you tackle them is entirely up to you. I had the misfortune of minimal explosive firepower, as I mentioned. This meant a heck of a lot of near-dark melee combat with gnarly-looking enemies, some of which are fantastically animated so they can leap around the various crevices of the cave and come at you from any angle. A decent pair of directional headphones proved useful here, but as I was saying, everybody comes at this from a different angle, and that is one of the ways that the game really excels, because it promotes this idea that you're a survivor, and that you'll use any means necessary to progress, even if it might seem clunky, or impractical, or indeed overkill. Where the cave-dwelling enemies tend to offer tough, scary encounters that have you keep a watchful eye on your resources, the cannibals offer a very different and welcome challenge. They actually don't attack automatically like monsters, instead taking varied actions that for the most part are more human. They come in different flavours and act in different ways. Some mud-covered lost boys who burst from the bushes and scamper around like animals, others are covered in paint and seem mad. Others wear clothes that make you wonder whether they were scavenged from victims or whether these are in fact visitors to the island that were driven mad by something insidious. Some have bone armour that offer more of a challenge up close, and all of them act differently, forcing you to carefully watch them to gauge their levels of aggression, because fighting is never a sure thing, so generally you want to avoid a confrontation where you can. From stalking you in the night, to weeping over fallen comrades, to running away when you have an outburst of violence, or worse yet, thrust a rotten head in their direction. Their methods and actions vary enough that you'll never really be confident of what they're going to do next. Sprinting away is always a viable option, but if they're hovering around somewhere that you want to be, playing the part of hunter and then hearing a giveaway rustle, or perhaps hearing a distant war cry that indicates you've now become the hunted, is a game of cat and mouse that almost never gets old. As your weapons progress, the status shifts from dangerous enemy to something more akin to a pest, which is all part of the evolving experience as the seasons roll on and you grow into a veteran of the island. And at times late game, you'll probably find yourself feeling like shouting, "Don't you know who the hell I am?" as you're making short work of them from a tactically superior position. Story-wise, the various players on the island are numerous, with a number of overlapping story arcs that you'll become increasingly familiar with the more you find. These include long-dead missionaries, suicidal cult members, recently slain workers, your own downed teammates, the native cannibals, various mutant hybrids, and even curiously named demons, although I won't expand on that as their relevance and origin is one of the more tantalizing mysteries of the island.
They're not like the others.
And there are more than that too. I'm not kidding, that's not even the full list. And all of them you'll come to recognize and understand as you continuously uncover notes and memos and books and leaflets and newspaper clippings and email correspondence and more. Annoyingly, you flip them over in an uncontrolled animation, and so seeing what's on the back can be a bit of a faff. You can just pull it out a second time. This is an exploration game that understands the importance of ramming the place wall to wall with discoverable locations and intuitive clues that actually rewards you for exploring. Not just pathetic scraps that allude to something irrelevant, but juicy memos and clear exchanges that build on the various tales of the island and succeed in giving you more context as you progress. Is it realistic? Hell no. The plot in this game is about as believable as a flat earther. Despite being infested with cannibals, and pretty confrontational ones too, the corporate interests of the island was served uninterrupted for some time, including but not limited to hapless workers from the mainland, building pretty substantial facilities. Don't ask me why I got so bogged down in this detail, but I desperately wanted to uncover how they achieved all this without the cannibals taking them out. But that one little nugget was largely brushed aside for the far more bombastic revelations that fuel the core narrative. The event that caused what is effectively ground zero, leading to an island full of death and carnage and our protagonist being summoned, is addressed in full, but the roughly 4/5 of the notes that I found on the playthrough failed to fully tie up this particular plot point. But here's the funniest thing. I love a good story and I get frustrated by plot holes as much as the next person, but I surprised myself in how little I was actually bothered by the unanswered questions as I reached the end. The all-encompassing amusement that you draw from what is essentially a B-movie horror, chock-a-block with dark humour, over-the-top villains, exciting and mysterious bunkers, and baddies that exist solely to be struck down, all pile atop one another to create an experience that just keeps on delivering. You probably won't notice what isn't, because there is so much of what is. Plot holes that do exist are just smothered by charming set pieces, mysterious imagery that alludes to more questions, and countless interacting NPCs, all with their own motives. There's just so much to uncover, and the narrative-focused environments were a hell of a lot more expansive and fleshed out than I'd expected going in. In hindsight, yes, you might start to question the answers that you've never uncovered, but while playing, you're just overwhelmed by so many overlapping story arcs that you won't stop to think. You'll just enjoy and push on. The actor Sean Ashmore was brought in to voice the previously silent Timmy, and while his dialogue is kind of sparse and relatively uninspired if I'm being honest,
It's not safe here. You're running out of time. It's gonna happen again. You have to leave.
is a long way from being disappointing, and he definitely does his bits to humanise what little relationship we get between the core characters. When you progress into the endgame segments, the creative visuals continue to build before you're eventually rewarded with some pretty brazen story beats that you won't see coming, and you're given a sneak peek at something that's been alluded to throughout, but until the very end remains unseen. And it's bloody great. I loved it. It completely fits with what you might expect, having progressed through an increasingly outrageous retro horror extravaganza by that stage. This final corridor here probably tells any gamer everything they need to know about what happens next. After which, the game concludes in a series of charming cinematic epilogues before the credits roll, which had me grinning ear to ear about how endearing it all is. The credits play out like an old movie still, with adjacent expositions detailing the aftermath and once again setting us up for another sequel, if the Ed Knight team can find the energy. Or in true Forest style, you can reload your final save and opt to stay on the island, killing cannibals, building out your base and hunting down any weapons and tools you missed, which in my case was a fair few. There is also a new location unveiled at this stage which relates to the artifact and unlocks a game-changing ability which I alluded to earlier, and I really applaud the designers for at least giving you this option, even if you don't choose to indulge. So many games end without a new game plus, and hitting continue just boots up your final save as if you haven't just beaten the game. You are just playing for playing's sake, but if you have a larger group and give yourself tasks Minecraft style, like to build absurd bases in hard to reach areas, the amount of replayability is limited only by your imagination. I always rather fancied an alpine log cabin, and as London is severely lacking mountains, logs and snow, it turned out that this was my best bet. At the end of the day, when you finally relent and stop repeatedly crossing the same segments again and again to get back to your base and just push forward with the story tasks, you'll be rewarded with a rich and content-filled experience. If your collection of armor and general inventory really is filled to the brim, and your survival handbook is perhaps stuffed with a bunch of new game-changing inventions that you desperately want to try out, and or perhaps you just fancy a change of pace after hours of action and horror, then it is worth making the 30-minute hike around cannibal camps and environmental obstacles to get back to your base. If you're frugal with your return trips but maximise on what you do once you're back, the island retains enough discoverable locations that when you cross it, it keeps the adventure flowing nicely. It's only been 2 or 3 days since I stopped playing and started writing this script, and already I'm thinking about how I might convince my friend to invest a couple of weekends into the game with me, so I can attack it again from a different angle, which is saying something considering how much I've just played. Almost all of these frustrations that I've listed can actually be mitigated if you just know about them in advance and work around them. And to be honest, one person's frustrations may well actually be another gamer's guilty pleasure. This was just my experience after I completed the story and found that Steam had recently passed 100 hours. And having spent another few days refining what I'd written, I just noticed that it's hit 120. And you know, I think it's gonna keep on going. If you enjoyed this, then a like or a subscribe would be so valuable to me. Honestly, thank you for that. And if not, then thank you so much for watching to the end. I hope I convinced you to play the game, or gave you a suitably spoiler-free insight into what this series is all about. Take care of yourself, and hopefully see you next time.